Chapter 4. Mr. and Mrs. Quilp resided on Tower Hill, and in her bower on Tower Hill, Mrs. Quilp was left to pine the absence of her lord, when he quitted her on the business which he had already seen to transact. Mr. Quilp could scarcely be said to be of any particular trade or calling, though his pursuits were diversified and his occupations numerous. He collected the rents of whole colonies of filthy streets and alleys by the waterside, advanced money to the seamen and petty officers of merchant vessels, had a share in the ventures of divers mates of East Indiamen, smoked his smuggled cigars under the very nose of the custom-house, and made appointments on 'change with men in glazed hats and round jackets pretty well every day. On the Surrey side of the river was a small rat-infested dreary yard called Quilp's Wharf, in which were a little wooden counting-house burrowing all awry in the dust as if it had fallen from the clouds and ploughed into the ground, a few fragments of rusty anchors, several large iron rings, some piles of rotten wood, and 2 or 3 heaps of old sheet copper, crumpled, cracked, and battered. On Quilp's Wharf, Daniel Quilp was a shipbreaker, yet to judge from these appearances he must either have been a shipbreaker on a very small scale, or have broken his ships up very small indeed. Neither did the place present any extraordinary aspect of life or activity, as its only human occupant was an amphibious boy in a canvas suit, whose sole change of occupation was from sitting on the head of a pile and throwing stones into the mud when the tide was out, to standing with his hands in his pockets gazing listlessly on the motion and on the bustle of the river at high water. The dwarf's lodging on Tower Hill comprised, besides the needful accommodation for himself and Mrs. Quilp, a small sleeping closet for that lady's mother, who resided with the couple and waged perpetual war with Daniel, of whom, notwithstanding, she stood in no slight dread. Indeed, the ugly creature contrived by some means or other, whether by his ugliness or his ferocity or his natural cunning is no great matter, to impress with a wholesome fear of his anger most of those with whom he was brought into daily contact and communication. Over nobody had he such complete ascendance as Mrs. Quilp herself, a pretty little, mild-spoken, blue-eyed woman who, having allied herself in wedlock to the dwarf in one of those strange infatuations of which examples are by no means scarce, performed a sound practical penance for her folly every day of her life. It has been said that Mrs. Quilp was pining in her bower. In her bower she was, but not alone, for besides the old lady, her mother, of whom mention has recently been made, there were present some half-dozen ladies of the neighborhood who had happened by a strange accident, and also by a little understanding among themselves, to drop in one after another, just about tea-time, this being a season favorable to conversation, and the room being a cool, shady, lazy kind of place, with some plants at the open window shutting out the dust, and interposing pleasantly enough between the tea-table within and the old tower without. It is no wonder that the ladies felt an inclination to talk and linger, especially when there are taken into account the additional inducements of fresh butter, new bread, shrimps, and watercresses. Now, the ladies being together under these circumstances, it was extremely natural that the discourse should turn upon the propensity of mankind to tyrannize over the weaker sex, and the duty that developed upon the weaker sex to resist that tyranny and assert their rights and dignity. It was natural for 4 reasons. Firstly, because Mrs. Quilp, being a young woman, and notoriously under the dominion of her husband, ought to be excited to rebel. Secondly, because Mrs. Quilp's parent was known to be laudably shrewish in her disposition, and inclined to resist male authority. Thirdly, because each visitor wished to show for herself how superior she was in this respect to the generality of her sex. And fourthly, because the company, being accustomed to scandalize each other in pairs, were deprived of their usual subject of conversation now that they were all assembled in close friendship, and had consequently no better employment than to attack the common enemy. Moved by these considerations, a stout lady opened the proceedings by inquiring, with an air of great concern and sympathy, how Mr. Quilp was, whereunto Mr. Quilp's wife's mother replied sharply, "Oh, he was well enough. Nothing much was ever the matter with him, and ill weeds were sure to thrive." All the ladies then sighed in concert, shook their heads gravely, and looked at Mrs. Quilp as a martyr. "Ah," said the spokeswoman, "I wish you'd give her a little of your advice, Mrs. Jiniwin." Mrs. Quilp had been a Miss Jiniwin, it should be observed. "Nobody knows better than you, ma'am, what us women owe to ourselves." "Oh, indeed, ma'am," replied Mrs. Jiniwin. "When my poor husband, her dear father, was alive, if he had ever ventured a cross word to me, I'd have—" The good old lady didn't finish the sentence, but she twisted off the head of a shrimp with a vindictiveness which seemed to imply that the action was in some degree a substitute for words. In this light it was clearly understood by the other party, who immediately replied with great approbation, "You quite enter into my feelings, ma'am, and it's just what I'd do myself." "But you have no call to do it," said Mrs. Jiniwin. "Luckily for you, you have no more occasion to do it than I had." "No woman need have if she was true to herself," rejoined the stout lady. "Do you hear that, Betsy?" said Mrs. Jiniwin in a warning voice. "How often have I said the same words to you, and almost gone down my knees when I spoke 'em?" Poor Mrs. Quilp, who had looked in a state of helplessness from one face of condolence to another, colored, smiled, and shook her head doubtfully. This was the signal for a general clamor, which, beginning in a low murmur, gradually swelled into a great noise in which everybody spoke at once, and all said that she, being a young woman, had no right to set up her opinions against the experiences of those who knew so much better, that it was very wrong of her not to take the advice of people who had nothing at heart but her good, that it was next door to being downright ungrateful to conduct herself in that manner, that if she had no respect for herself, she ought to have some for other women, all of whom she compromised by her meekness, and that, if she had no respect for other women, the time would come when other women would have no respect for her, and she would be very sorry for that, they could tell her. Having dealt out these admonitions, the ladies fell to a more powerful assault than they had yet made upon the mixed tea, new bread, fresh butter, shrimps, and watercresses, and said that their vexation was so great to see her going on like that they could hardly bring themselves to eat a single morsel.